The strangest opportunities don't arrive looking like miracles. They arrive looking like temporary jobs you almost turned down. If someone had told me that answering one unexpected phone call would reshape everything I believed about loyalty, success, and the people closest to me, I would have laughed and gone back to refreshing job listings. My name is Killian Mendez. At 25, my life looked perfectly respectable from the outside. I worked as an office administrator for a small logistics company outside Charleston, South Carolina. The paycheck covered rent for my apartment. My used sedan still started every morning, and I spent enough evenings at the gym to stay in decent shape. But every Monday felt exactly like the Monday before it. I wasn't building anything. I was just maintaining a routine that seemed to stretch endlessly into the future. My best friend, Max Russo, had always been the opposite. He chased opportunities the way some people chase sunsets. We had known each other since elementary school, survived awkward teenage years together, celebrated college graduations, and somehow remained close despite taking completely different paths. When he called to tell me he'd been accepted into a graduate program in London for the summer, I was genuinely excited for him, even though it meant we'd barely see each other for months. We met for coffee the afternoon before his flight, and somewhere between talking about airport security and reminding him not to forget his passport, he casually mentioned something that barely registered at first. "Dad's still looking for temporary help with one of his restoration projects," he said while stirring his iced coffee. "You'd probably hate all the paperwork, but he'd pay better than your current job." I smiled. "That's a glowing recommendation." Max laughed. "Seriously, just call him. Worst thing he can say is no." His father, Raymond Russo, wasn't someone you casually called. At least that's how I saw it. Around Charleston, plenty of people knew his name. Some knew him because he'd built a respected architectural restoration company that specialized in preserving historic buildings across the Southeast. Others knew him from the fitness center he co-owned with his younger brother, where half the city seemed determined to become stronger before beach season. I'd only met Raymond a handful of times over the years at birthday cookouts and holiday dinners. Every memory was the same. At 46, he stood a little taller than everyone else, broad shoulders filling out simple athletic shirts, short blonde hair always neat, clean-shaven face, calm blue eyes that somehow made people stop talking without raising his voice. He wasn't intimidating because he acted tough. He was intimidating because he never needed to prove anything. I almost ignored Max's suggestion. Temporary work didn't sound like progress. It sounded like pressing pause on a career that already felt stalled. But after another week of staring at disappointing job postings and calculating how much my rent would increase when the lease renewed, I finally picked up my phone. Raymond answered himself. His voice was warm, almost surprisingly relaxed. "Killian, Max told me you might call." Before I could rehearse the speech I'd prepared, he said, "Can you come by tomorrow morning? 9 o'clock. The next morning, I drove across Charleston to the company's headquarters, a beautifully restored brick warehouse overlooking the Cooper River. The building itself looked like proof of the company's reputation. Original exposed beams crossed high ceilings. Sunlight poured through enormous factory windows. Historic photographs lined the walls beside modern architectural renderings. Instead of feeling like a dusty construction office, it felt like a place where history and ambition somehow shared the same address. A receptionist welcomed me before leading me upstairs. I expected to meet a hiring manager or department supervisor. Instead, Raymond was waiting outside his office holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need one," he said, handing me the larger cup. The interview barely resembled an interview. He asked about my work habits, what frustrated me at my current job, what kinds of projects actually made me feel useful, and what I wanted my career to look like 5 years from now. Nobody had ever asked me that last question without sounding like they were reading from a script. I admitted I didn't really know anymore. Instead of looking disappointed, Raymond nodded thoughtfully. "That's more honest than pretending you've got everything figured out." By the end of the conversation, he surprised me again. "I'd like you to start 2 weeks from Monday, after you have had time to give your current employer proper notice. You'll be helping coordinate documentation for our biggest summer restoration project." I thanked him, still trying to process how quickly everything had happened. Then he added something even stranger. "You'll report directly to me." I blinked. "Directly to you?" "Yes. Wouldn't someone else be a better fit?" He smiled. "No, I think this arrangement will work better." I left the office carrying employment paperwork a company access badge, and far more questions than answers. I kept telling myself Max had probably exaggerated how busy his father was. Maybe Raymond simply preferred being hands-on. Maybe the company was smaller than I imagined. But as I walked toward the parking lot, I glanced back through one of the warehouse windows. Raymond was already standing inside speaking with 3 senior project managers, confidently directing a meeting that looked important enough to fill his entire day, which made one question impossible to ignore. Why would someone responsible for an operation that size personally choose to spend his summer working beside me? I had no idea that question was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, after completing my notice period at the logistics company, my first week with Raymond's team disappeared faster than I expected. Instead of burying me under endless spreadsheets, Raymond rotated me through nearly every corner of the company. One morning, I was organizing permit applications with the project coordinators. By lunch, I was reviewing restoration timelines with architects. Before the afternoon ended, I was helping compare historical photographs against current construction reports. Every assignment seemed unrelated until I realized Raymond was quietly teaching me how every department depended on the others. He never lectured. He simply asked questions that forced me to notice details I would have ignored a month earlier. What happens if this permit arrives 3 days late? He asked one afternoon while handing me a project calendar. I answered that construction would simply start later. He smiled. Look again. I followed the schedule more carefully. A delayed permit would postpone the masonry crew, which would delay the electricians, which would force the painters to reschedule, eventually affecting the city inspection and costing thousands of dollars in labor. Raymond nodded with obvious satisfaction. Every document represents real people waiting to do their jobs. That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. At my old office, paperwork always felt like paperwork. Here it felt like responsibility. The company itself surprised me almost as much as Raymond did. Employees greeted him by his first name without fear, yet everyone respected him immediately. He remembered birthdays, asked about families, congratulated apprentices when they mastered new restoration techniques, and somehow knew which employee's daughter had just earned a college scholarship. There was nothing performative about it. He simply paid attention. I tried not to notice how often my own attention followed him across a room, or how differently his quiet approval affected me compared with praise from anyone else. During lunch breaks, I occasionally caught him eating with interns instead of executives. One afternoon, I walked into the workshop expecting to find him in a meeting, only to discover him carefully repairing the carved arm of an antique oak chair beside one of the senior craftsmen. The older craftsman smiled at me and said, "He still insists on getting his hands dirty." Raymond only laughed and replied, "It reminds me why we do all the paperwork upstairs." Around the middle of my second week, something happened that made me realize there was another side of him almost nobody talked about. We stopped by a local technical college to deliver restored drafting tables the company had donated. As we prepared to leave, the dean thanked Raymond for funding another year's worth of restoration scholarships. I looked at him, surprised. I did not know the company had a scholarship program. Before Raymond could answer, the dean smiled warmly. "The company does not. Raymond does." Raymond politely changed the subject before we reached the parking lot, but my curiosity only grew stronger. Why would someone keep something like that completely private? The answer never came because he redirected our conversation toward work, asking my opinion about improving the digital archive system. It was the first time anyone in a leadership position had seriously asked for my ideas instead of simply assigning tasks. I spent that evening sketching out suggestions, expecting him to glance at them for a few seconds. Instead, he spent nearly an hour reviewing every page with me the following morning, asking thoughtful questions and writing notes in the margins. By Friday afternoon, several of my suggestions were already being tested by the administrative staff. For the first time in years, I drove home feeling that something I contributed actually mattered. The following Monday, Raymond handed me a small brass key attached to an old leather tag. "There is something I want you to help me with," he said. "This key only opens the archive during business hours, and for now, you will use it only while I am working with you. The room contains confidential legal and project records, so every document that leaves a shelf must be logged." He led me down a quiet hallway I had never noticed before, stopping in front of a thick wooden door tucked behind the accounting offices. The brass plate beside it simply read "Archive." He unlocked the door, and motioned for me to follow. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched across the room, filled with carefully labeled blueprints, restoration journals, handwritten correspondence, engineering sketches, and project records dating back decades. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. "These files tell the story of every building we have ever saved," Raymond said quietly. "I have been meaning to organize them properly for years." We worked side by side for hours, scanning documents into the digital system and matching physical records with electronic catalogs. Everything appeared meticulously organized until I reached one particular project from nearly 20 years earlier. The file index listed 12 original blueprint pages, but only 7 remained inside the folder. Assuming someone had misfiled the rest, I searched nearby shelves without success. "Raymond," I called, holding up the folder. "I think part of this file is missing." He crossed the room, glanced at the label, and for the first time since I had met him, his calm expression changed almost imperceptibly. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. He gently took the folder from my hands, closed it, and placed it back on the shelf. "We will work on another section today," he said evenly. He offered no explanation, and I did not press him. But as we locked the archive that evening, one thought refused to leave my mind. Those pages had not been misplaced by accident. Someone had removed them deliberately, and judging by the look that briefly crossed Raymond's face, he knew exactly why. After the strange moment inside the archive, I convinced myself I had imagined Raymond's reaction. Every company had confidential records. Every long-running business had projects people preferred not to revisit. It was none of my business, and I had been hired to organize files, not investigate old mysteries. That promise to myself lasted exactly 4 days. Early Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside the office felt completely different. Conversations stopped whenever someone walked by. Phones rang constantly. Department managers hurried between conference rooms carrying stacks of documents. Even before I reached my desk, I knew something had gone wrong. Raymond stepped out of his office holding a tablet and motioned for me to come inside. His expression remained composed, but there was a heaviness behind his eyes I had never seen before. "The city has temporarily suspended work on the Ashcroft Theater restoration," he said. I immediately recognized the name. It was the company's largest project of the year, a historic downtown theater scheduled to reopen before the holiday season. "What happened?" I asked. Raymond slid the tablet across the desk. An official notice claimed that discrepancies had been discovered in restoration documentation submitted years earlier during the planning process. Until the records could be verified, construction would stop. Hundreds of workers from multiple contractors suddenly had nothing to do. I expected Raymond to react with frustration, but instead he calmly closed the document. "We are going to verify every record ourselves," he said. "Facts solve problems faster than panic." His confidence spread through the office almost immediately. Rather than blaming employees or holding dramatic emergency meetings, he divided responsibilities with remarkable precision. Architects reviewed structural drawings. Legal advisors contacted city officials. Project managers coordinated revised schedules. Then he looked at me. "The archive is now our priority." Within an hour, we were surrounded by decades of permits, engineering reports, inspection certificates, and handwritten project notes. I quickly realized why Raymond had spent the past 2 weeks teaching me how every department connected. Without understanding the entire process, none of these records would make sense together. Around midday, while comparing permit dates with archive correspondence, I noticed something unusual. Several documents referenced a supplemental engineering report that did not appear anywhere in the digital catalog. I checked neighboring files. Nothing. I searched another shelf. Still nothing. "Raymond," I said carefully, "these references all point to the same report, but I cannot find the actual document." He walked over, studied the folder for several seconds, then quietly nodded. "Make a note of every missing reference. Do not assume they disappeared today." That answer raised even more questions. If missing records had existed for years, why had no one noticed until now? Before I could ask, his office phone rang. I overheard only fragments of the conversation. "Understood." "Yes, we will cooperate completely." "No, we have nothing to hide." When he returned, he looked tired for the first time since I had met him, yet his voice remained steady. "Keep working." That simple instruction somehow carried more reassurance than a long speech ever could. We stayed well past normal business hours. Outside, the Charleston skyline slowly shifted from bright afternoon sunlight to the warm glow of streetlights reflecting across the river. Inside the archive, only the soft hum of scanners and the turning of paper broke the silence. During one short coffee break, Raymond surprised me by telling me about his 20s. He admitted that his first restoration contract had nearly failed because he had underestimated how complicated historic preservation could be. "People think confidence comes first," he said with a faint smile. "Usually it comes after surviving enough mistakes." Hearing that changed something for me. Until then, I had quietly assumed successful people simply knew what they were doing from the beginning. Raymond made success sound much more human. We returned to work with renewed focus. Just before 9 o'clock that evening, I finally matched several handwritten inspection notes to an overlooked storage index, proving at least part of the city's concern came from incomplete cross-referencing rather than missing approvals. It was only one small piece of a much larger puzzle, but Raymond looked genuinely impressed. "You notice patterns," he said. "That cannot be taught." I drove home exhausted but strangely optimistic. Maybe we could solve this after all. The optimism disappeared the following morning. As soon as I entered the archive, I knew something was wrong. One of the rolling ladders had been moved. Several storage boxes sat slightly out of alignment. At first I assumed another employee had worked late after we left. Then I reached the shelf where we had organized the Ashcroft Theater records. 3 labeled document binders were gone. Not misplaced. Not transferred. Gone. Raymond arrived seconds later, looked at the empty space without saying a word, and immediately reached for the archive access log. When he finished reading it, his expression remained calm, but his voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Someone entered this room after we locked it last night." Raymond did not raise his voice or accuse anyone after discovering the missing binders. He simply locked the archive again, called the operations manager, and requested copies of the electronic access records for the previous 12 hours. His calmness somehow made the situation feel even more serious. Within an hour, every department supervisor had been instructed to verify inventory procedures, and the entire office shifted into a quiet, determined rhythm. Nobody panicked because Raymond refused to panic. He gathered everyone for a brief meeting and said only one thing that stayed with me for the rest of the day. "We solve problems by collecting facts, not by collecting suspects." Those words prevented the office from turning into a place filled with rumors, but that did not stop people from quietly wondering what had happened. Since I had been working closely with Raymond inside the archive, several coworkers naturally asked whether I knew what was missing. I answered honestly that I did not. That was the truth. I knew files had disappeared, but I still had no idea why those particular records mattered so much. Around lunchtime, while comparing backup scans against physical inventories, Raymond received a phone call that immediately softened his expression. "Your flight landed early?" he asked with a smile. "Come by whenever you get here." I looked up from my computer. "Max." Raymond nodded. "He has a few days between classes before returning overseas." Hearing that should have made me happy. Max and I had been exchanging occasional messages since he left for London, but they had become shorter as both of us grew busier. I was looking forward to catching up. He arrived just after 2 o'clock wearing jeans, a navy sweatshirt, and the same easy grin he had carried since high school. We hugged, joked about his terrible British cooking experiments, and spent a few minutes talking as though nothing had changed. Then something unexpected happened. As Raymond walked over to ask whether we wanted coffee, Max glanced between the two of us with a puzzled look. "You two spend this much time together every day?" he asked. "Pretty much," I answered. "He has been teaching me how everything works." Max forced a smile, but it never quite reached his eyes. "Sounds like Dad has finally found someone willing to listen to all his lectures." Raymond laughed good-naturedly. "Apparently Killian has more patience than you ever did." We all laughed. Yet something about Max's reaction felt different. It was subtle, almost impossible to explain, but the conversation no longer flowed as naturally as it always had. Later that afternoon, while Raymond stepped into a meeting with the legal team, Max wandered through the office with me. He complimented the restored building, joked with several employees who remembered him from previous summers, then suddenly stopped outside the archive door. "So this is where you have been hiding," he said. "More or less," I replied. "There are decades of company history in there." He looked at the locked door for a moment longer than seemed necessary. Dad never let me spend much time in that room. Why not? I asked. Max shrugged. The summer jobs he gave me were usually in project coordination or community outreach. He always said the archive contained legal records and confidential restoration files that had nothing to do with my assignments. Before I could ask anything else, he changed the subject, asking about my apartment and whether I was still driving my old sedan. The conversation moved on, but that brief pause stayed with me. Why would Raymond trust me with access to a room his own son rarely entered? By the end of the workday, Max invited me to dinner at a small seafood restaurant we had visited countless times growing up. Halfway through the meal, the conversation drifted back to work. You seem different, Max said while setting down his glass. Different how? More confident. I smiled. I guess I finally feel like I am learning something useful. He nodded slowly before asking another question. Do you ever wonder why Dad hired you instead of promoting someone already working there? I admitted that I had wondered about it. Maybe he just needed temporary help. Max looked out the window toward the harbor before quietly saying, Dad usually has reasons for everything. The sentence hung in the air between us. It was not an accusation, but it carried enough uncertainty to make me uncomfortable. We changed the subject again, talking about London, travel plans, and college memories. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something unspoken remained between us. The next morning, the operations manager finally delivered the overnight security report Raymond had requested. We gathered in his office while the building's security footage played across a large monitor. The timestamp showed Thursday evening, several hours before the missing binders were discovered. Max had apparently arrived in Charleston the night before he called Raymond and entered the building without telling either of us. At first, nothing happened. Then a familiar figure walked down the hallway toward the archive. The camera angle was not perfect, but there was no mistaking who it was. Raymond quietly paused the video, staring at the screen without saying a word. Standing outside the archive door, using an access badge only someone authorized could possess, was Max. He had worked at the company during previous summers, and nobody had realized his old access permissions were still active. For several long seconds, nobody inside Raymond's office spoke. The paused security image remained frozen on the monitor, showing Max standing outside the archive door with his access badge raised toward the reader. My first instinct was to explain it away. He had grown up around the company. Maybe he had returned to pick up something personal. Maybe the timestamp was wrong. Raymond quietly closed the video without reaching any conclusions. Continue reviewing the rest of the footage, he told the operations manager. I want facts, not assumptions. His response surprised me. If I had seen someone entering a restricted room after important files disappeared, I would have immediately started asking difficult questions. Raymond did the opposite. He refused to speculate. The operations manager nodded and left the office, leaving only the two of us behind. I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since the video stopped. Do you think Max took the files? Raymond looked out the window toward the harbor before answering. I think my son entered the archive. Everything. Beyond that is still unknown. His answer sounded simple, but it reminded me how easily people confuse evidence with conclusions. That afternoon, I could barely concentrate. Every time I opened another restoration file, I found myself remembering childhood afternoons at Max's house, birthday parties, family cookouts, and all the years we had spent looking out for each other. Nothing about the friend I knew matched the person secretly removing company records. The two versions simply could not exist together. Around 4 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Max asking if we could meet before he returned to London the following morning. I agreed without mentioning the security footage. We met at a quiet waterfront park overlooking Charleston Harbor just before sunset. After a few minutes of ordinary conversation, I finally decided there was no honest way to avoid the subject. The security system recorded you at the office the other night, I said carefully. Max did not look surprised. He lowered his eyes toward the water and let out a slow breath. I figured Dad would eventually find out. I landed Thursday evening, Max admitted. I did not call him until the next day because I wanted one chance to search the archive without being stopped. My heartbeat quickened. Why were you there? For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he answered with something I never expected. I was looking for the truth. I frowned. About what? He looked toward the distant marina before speaking again. About my mother. The answer caught me completely off guard. Max's mother had passed away when we were both teenagers after a long illness. Raymond had rarely spoken about that period of his life, and I had always assumed it was simply too painful to revisit. Max continued quietly. Ever since I was 16, I have felt like Dad has been protecting me from something. Every time I asked questions about Mom's final years, he changed the subject. Every time I wanted to look through old family records, certain boxes had already disappeared. I listened without interrupting. So you thought the archive had answers? He nodded once. I took the 3 binders, Max admitted. I found references to Mom's records inside them and panicked. I hid them in the cedar cabinet because I was afraid Dad would remove anything connected to her before I understood what it meant. I never intended to damage the company, and I was going to return them. His voice carried frustration, not anger. I wanted to know whether there was something about my family nobody would tell me. Before I could respond, another voice spoke from behind us. You should have asked me one more time. Both of us turned at the same moment. Raymond stood several yards away. He was not angry. He was not shouting. He simply looked tired in a way I had never seen before. For a long moment, father and son faced each other without speaking. Then Raymond slowly reached into the leather satchel hanging from his shoulder and removed a small brass key. I recognized it immediately. It was the archive key. Come with me, he said quietly. Less than 30 minutes later, the 3 of us stood inside the archive again. Max removed the 3 missing binders from the cedar cabinet and placed them on the table. Raymond checked each label carefully before handing them to me for inventory. Nothing had been destroyed, but their removal had made an already incomplete archive appear far more suspicious. Raymond walked past the shelves of restoration records toward an old cedar cabinet tucked into the far corner of the room, one I had never opened because it carried no project label. He unlocked it carefully and lifted out a single wooden box wrapped in a faded linen cloth. He placed it gently on the table before looking directly at Max. These never belonged to the company, he said. They belong to your mother. Max stared silently as Raymond removed the cloth, revealing dozens of neatly tied envelopes, journals, family photographs, and handwritten letters. Your mother asked me to keep these sealed until I believed you were ready to read them, Raymond explained softly. Not because they contained something shameful, but because they contained the parts of her life she wanted you to understand as an adult, not as a grieving teenager. Max's eyes filled with emotion as he carefully picked up the first envelope. Written across the front in elegant handwriting were 5 simple words. For my son, when ready. As he opened the letter with trembling hands, a folded sheet of paper slipped onto the table. It was not written by his mother. Across the top appeared the name of a former business partner I had never heard Raymond mention before, and the first sentence immediately made Raymond's expression change. If these records are ever challenged, preserve this statement and do not allow anyone to alter or remove the original restoration files. The room became so quiet that I could hear the old clock above the archive shelves ticking with steady precision. Raymond carefully unfolded the loose page while Max continued reading his mother's first letter in silence. I watched Raymond's eyes move slowly across the document before he finally looked up at both of us. I hoped this would never become relevant again, he said quietly. He placed the paper flat on the table. It was a signed statement written nearly 20 years earlier by his former business partner, Norman Pitts. In it, Norman admitted that he intended to pressure local officials into approving redevelopment plans that would replace several protected historic buildings with luxury commercial properties. Raymond had refused to participate, believing the buildings deserved to be preserved. Their partnership ended immediately afterward. I thought walking away ended the matter, Raymond explained. Instead, Norman blamed me for everything he lost. Max slowly lowered his mother's letter. You never told me any of this. Raymond gave him a tired smile. Because I wanted you to grow up without carrying my conflicts. The explanation felt painfully honest. There was no dramatic speech, only a father admitting that silence had seemed easier than burdening his son with old mistakes. We spent the next several hours reviewing every document inside the cedar box. Most of the letters came from Max's mother. They spoke about family memories, lessons she hoped her son would carry into adulthood, and the quiet strength she admired in Raymond even during difficult times. Hidden among them were several business records. She had insisted Raymond protect because she feared Norman might someday try to rewrite history. Around midnight, I noticed something unusual. Several letters referenced permit numbers that matched the missing engineering reports we had been searching for inside the archive. Raymond, I said, spreading the documents across the table, these numbers are connected. He leaned forward immediately. Together we compared dates, inspection records, and handwritten notes. The pattern slowly emerged. The supposedly missing reports had not disappeared completely. Their reference numbers had been intentionally separated across multiple filing systems years earlier, as a security precaution after Norman threatened legal action. Raymond looked at me with genuine surprise. I never realized Diana divided the documentation this way. Hearing Max's mother's name spoken with quiet respect somehow made the room feel warmer despite the late hour. We returned to organizing every piece of evidence. The more connections we found, the clearer the story became. Norman had never accepted responsibility for losing the partnership. Instead, he had apparently spent years claiming Raymond manipulated restoration records. If someone recently revived those accusations using incomplete files, the city would naturally suspend construction until everything could be verified. Suddenly, the entire situation made sense. Max's temporary removal of the binders had unintentionally made the archive look even more incomplete, but the city's original concern had begun much earlier because key reports had been divided among separate filing systems. The realization energized all three of us. Early the next morning, Raymond contacted the company's attorney and arranged a meeting with city officials for later that week. Before leaving the archive, he turned toward me. You noticed connections that experienced professionals overlooked. I shook my head. I only followed the paperwork. He smiled. That is exactly what good investigators do. It was the first time anyone had ever described me that way. Later that afternoon, while the legal team prepared certified copies of every recovered document, I continued, reviewing digital storage logs to ensure nothing else had been overlooked. One old inventory spreadsheet caught my attention. Most archived materials had eventually been transferred into the building's secure storage rooms, but one item remained listed as active under an off-site rental agreement. The location had never been updated. Curious, I opened the attached record. It described a climate-controlled storage locker originally rented under the former partnership's name nearly 2 decades earlier. After the partnership ended, the account had been transferred into a legal trust still associated with Norman Pitts. According to the payment history, the rental fees had continued automatically through a legal trust account without interruption. I immediately printed the record and carried it into Raymond's office. He studied the page for several moments before slowly sitting back in his chair. I thought that storage unit had been emptied years ago, he said. Apparently, it never was. Max looked from the document to his father. If Norman left anything behind, it could answer every remaining question. Raymond nodded once, but his expression remained cautious. Or it could contain nothing useful at all. Even so, none of us could ignore the possibility. By the end of the day, the attorney had arranged legal authorization to access the abandoned storage unit the following morning. As we prepared to leave the office, I glanced once more at the faded rental agreement lying on Raymond's desk. In the margin, beside Norman Pitts' signature, someone had handwritten 7 words that had not appeared in any other document we had found. Preserve everything until the whole truth can be proven. The next morning began long before sunrise. Raymond, Max, the company attorney, and I drove to a secure storage facility on the outskirts of Charleston carrying the legal authorization that allowed us to open the abandoned unit. The manager explained that the locker had remained untouched for years because the rental payments continued automatically through a trust account. No one had requested access since the original agreement was signed. Hearing that made the silence between us even heavier. When the steel door finally rolled upward, none of us rushed inside. Dust covered neatly stacked archival boxes, old drafting tubes, filing cabinets, and several pieces of wrapped furniture. Nothing looked abandoned in the careless sense. Everything had been packed with remarkable precision, almost as though someone expected another person to return someday and continue exactly where the work had stopped. Raymond slowly walked toward the first cabinet and rested his hand on it before quietly saying, Norman always believed organization made information powerful. We spent the next hour opening boxes one at a time, carefully documenting every item. Most contained duplicate project files, correspondence, financial ledgers, and engineering drawings from projects completed decades earlier. Then Max opened a weathered leather journal tucked inside a cardboard archive box. The handwriting on the first page belonged to his mother. He looked at Raymond in disbelief. How did this end up here? Raymond shook his head. I have never seen that journal before. The attorney examined an old intake receipt attached to the box. Diana had deposited the journal shortly after Raymond and Norman ended their partnership, using the unit as an off-site backup before access to it was transferred into the trust. Norman apparently never knew which box she had added or what it contained. We gathered around as Max carefully turned the pages. Unlike the personal letters she had written to him, this journal recorded daily observations about the restoration business, Norman's increasingly aggressive proposals to replace protected buildings with commercial developments, and Raymond's repeated refusal to approve them. She described meetings, conversations, and decisions with remarkable detail. Halfway through the journal, a folded envelope slipped from between the pages. Inside was a notarized statement signed by Norman himself acknowledging that Raymond had rejected every questionable proposal presented to him. The document directly contradicted the accusations now threatening the company. I immediately realized what that meant. This clears Raymond, I said almost instinctively. The attorney carefully examined the statement before nodding. If this document is authenticated, it changes everything. For the first time since the city suspended the restoration project, genuine relief appeared on Raymond's face. But Max continued reading the journal in silence. Eventually, he reached the final entries written during his mother's illness. His voice became quieter with every sentence. She wrote that Raymond rarely slept because he divided every day between running the company, caring for her, and protecting their family's future. She described how he quietly refused business opportunities that would have made him wealthy because accepting them would have destroyed buildings she believed deserved to survive for future generations. Most painfully, she admitted asking Raymond to shield Max from those conflicts until he became mature enough to understand that doing the right thing often looked foolish in the moment. Max slowly closed the journal and looked at his father with tears in his eyes. I spent years believing you were hiding something from me, he said softly. Raymond answered with the same calm honesty that had defined him from the beginning. I was hiding your mother's burdens, not the truth. Neither man moved for several seconds. Then Max quietly stepped forward and embraced his father. No dramatic speeches followed. None were necessary. Watching them reconcile after carrying years of misunderstanding reminded me that some conversations simply take time before people are ready to hear them. By late afternoon, certified copies of the recovered records had already been delivered to the city's review committee. 2 days later, the official decision finally arrived. The suspension on the Ashcroft Theater restoration was lifted. Independent reviewers confirmed that the original documentation had been manipulated through missing records rather than fraudulent construction practices. The company was fully cleared to continue its work. Employees applauded when Raymond announced the news, but he accepted the congratulations with the same quiet humility he had shown during the crisis. As the office slowly returned to normal, I found myself thinking about something entirely different. My temporary contract would end in less than 2 weeks. The company no longer needed emergency help. The crisis was over. My job was finished. That evening, after everyone had left, I quietly typed a letter confirming that I would leave when my temporary contract ended, thanking Raymond for an opportunity that had changed the way I viewed both work and myself. I printed it, folded it carefully, and slipped it into an envelope addressed to him. The following morning, just as I placed the envelope on the corner of my desk, my phone vibrated with a message from Raymond asking me to stop by his office before I left for the day because there was something important he wanted to discuss. For the rest of the week, the office gradually settled back into its familiar rhythm. Phones no longer rang with constant urgency, project managers laughed again during lunch, and the Ashcroft Theater restoration resumed exactly where it had stopped. Walking through the building, it almost felt as though the crisis had never happened. Yet I knew I had changed in ways that would not disappear simply because normal life had returned. I no longer looked at paperwork as stacks of paper. I saw people depending on every decision hidden inside those folders. More importantly, I no longer saw myself as someone simply filling a position until something better came along. Even so, I believed my time there was over. I had accepted the job for one summer. The emergency had been resolved. Staying longer felt like crossing a line I had never intended to cross. Every time I looked at the letter confirming my departure waiting inside my desk drawer, I reminded myself that leaving was the responsible decision. Late Friday afternoon, after most employees had already gone home for the weekend, Raymond called and asked whether I had a few minutes. I slipped the unopened envelope into my folder before walking to his office. The door was already open. Instead of sitting behind his desk, Raymond stood beside the large windows overlooking the river, watching the final sunlight reflect across the water. He turned and smiled when I entered. "Close the door, please." My heart immediately began racing. I wondered whether he had somehow discovered the letter confirming my departure before I had handed it to him. He invited me to sit before placing a slim presentation folder on the table between us. "Before we talk," he said, "I want you to look through this." Inside were organizational charts, renovation schedules, technology proposals, and a strategic plan for modernizing the company's document management system. Many of the recommendations looked strangely familiar. Then I realized why. They were based almost entirely on ideas I had casually suggested during my first few weeks. I looked up in confusion. "You kept all of this?" Raymond nodded. "Every suggestion." I laughed softly. "I thought you were just being polite." I was paying attention. That simple answer carried more weight than he probably realized. He sat across from me and folded his hands. "Our company has grown faster than our internal systems. We need someone who understands both people and organization. Someone willing to ask questions before making assumptions." I immediately understood where the conversation was heading. "Raymond," he gently interrupted me, "I would like you to stay, not as temporary help, as our full-time operations development manager." I stared at him, genuinely speechless. The position was far beyond anything I had imagined for myself only a few months earlier. "I do not have enough experience," I finally admitted. Raymond smiled exactly as he had during my interview. "Experience grows. Character is much harder to teach." Before I could respond, there was a quiet knock on the open door. Max stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked from me to his father and immediately understood what was happening. "Did he finally ask?" Raymond nodded once. I expected Max to tease me or joke that I was stealing his father's attention again. Instead, he set 1 coffee in front of me and smiled. "I really hope you say yes." I looked at him in surprise. "You do? When I left for London, I worried about you more than I admitted. You kept settling for jobs that never appreciated what you could do." He shrugged with an embarrassed grin. "That is actually why I told Dad to call you in the first place." I blinked. "You recommended me?" Max laughed. "Not exactly. I told him you were the most dependable person I knew, but that you would probably never believe it unless someone else gave you a chance." I slowly turned toward Raymond. He quietly nodded. "Your interview mattered. You earned this position yourself." But Max was the reason I looked more closely instead of posting the job publicly. For several moments I could not think of anything to say. I had spent the entire summer believing I had simply been lucky enough to receive an unexpected opportunity. Instead, I realized that my best friend had quietly opened a door because he believed in me long before I believed in myself. I finally reached into my folder, removed the sealed envelope confirming my planned departure, and placed it on the table. Raymond glanced at my name written across the front, but made no move to open it. I smiled for the first time since entering his office, tore the envelope in half, and dropped it into the recycling bin beside his desk. Max laughed. Raymond's smile widened, but before anyone spoke again, he looked directly at me with an expression more thoughtful than I had ever seen. "There is one more reason I hoped you would stay," he said quietly, "and it has nothing to do with the company." Raymond's words lingered in the quiet office longer than I expected. He looked toward Max for a moment, and Max quietly collected the empty coffee cups before stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind him. "I need to be careful about what I say next," Raymond began. "You currently report directly to me, and I would never use my position to place you in an uncomfortable situation." My heartbeat quickened, but I remained silent. "Somewhere during this summer, you became more important to me than an employee should become to his supervisor," he continued. "I tried to tell myself it was only admiration for your work, but that stopped being honest a long time ago." I looked down at my hands, suddenly aware that the feelings I had avoided naming were no longer mine alone. Memories from the summer returned with unexpected clarity. The coffee he had waiting on the morning of my interview, the patience with which he reviewed every suggestion I made, the quiet evenings we spent inside the archive, and the way his approval had always mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. What I had called professional admiration had crossed into something more personal long before either of us found the courage to name it. "You are not the only one who has been trying to ignore it," I admitted. Relief softened his expression, but he did not move closer. "If you accept the permanent position, you will report to our operations director instead of me. I want your career protected, regardless of what happens between us." "And after that?" I asked. Raymond smiled gently. "After that, I would like to take you to dinner, not as your employer and not as Max's father, just as a man asking another man whether this might become something worth exploring." I accepted the position that afternoon. During the following months, life settled into a new rhythm. We introduced a modern document management system that made decades of restoration records easier to preserve and search. Experienced employees patiently shared knowledge with younger apprentices, while I focused on connecting departments that had once worked almost independently. Instead of feeling like the newest person in the building, I gradually became someone others approached for help. Raymond never treated me as though I needed to prove myself every day. He challenged me when necessary, encouraged me when I doubted my decisions, and always reminded me that asking thoughtful questions was a strength rather than a weakness. Max returned to London to complete his graduate program, but we spoke every week. Our friendship became stronger after we stopped pretending difficult conversations could be avoided forever. He often joked that leaving for one summer had accidentally created 2 careers instead of one. A few months later, the Ashcroft Theatre officially reopened after its restoration was completed. The grand opening drew city officials, local residents, preservation groups, former employees, and families whose grandparents still remembered attending performances there decades earlier. Standing inside the beautifully restored lobby, I watched children look up at the ornate ceiling while older couples quietly pointed toward details they had not seen in years. It reminded me that preserving history was never about bricks, wood, or paint alone. It was about giving people a place where memories could continue. During the ceremony, Raymond stepped to the podium to thank the architects, craftsmen, engineers, volunteers, and city partners who had contributed to the project. Then, unexpectedly, he invited me to stand beside him. I quietly shook my head, hoping he would continue without me, but he smiled and motioned again. As I joined him, he addressed the audience with the same steady voice I had come to respect. "Every successful restoration depends on people willing to notice the details others overlook," he said. This summer reminded our entire company that fresh perspectives can preserve more than buildings. Killian helped protect our history when we needed it most, and our future is stronger because he chose to stay. The applause that followed felt almost unreal. Months earlier, I had walked into this building convinced I was only filling a temporary position. Now I stood surrounded by colleagues who genuinely felt like a second family. After the ceremony ended, visitors slowly wandered through the restored theater while the evening sunlight filled the historic windows with warm gold. Max, home for a short visit, joined Raymond and me on the front steps overlooking the busy Charleston street. His eyes briefly moved between us before an amused smile appeared on his face. "So," he said, "are the two of you ever going to admit that your first dinner turned into several more?" I glanced at Raymond, unsure how much Max already knew. Raymond only smiled. "I was wondering how long it would take both of you," Max continued. "Just promise me you will not make every family dinner unbearably awkward." Raymond laughed, and the last uncertainty I had carried about Max's reaction quietly disappeared. None of us spoke for a while after that. We simply watched families enter the building together. Finally, Max smiled and laughed softly. Funny how the smallest decisions end up changing the biggest parts of life. Raymond nodded in quiet agreement. A few minutes later, Max excused himself to greet several former employees inside the theater, leaving Raymond and me alone on the front steps. The evening crowd moved around us, while warm lights spilled through the restored entrance behind us. Raymond looked toward me with the same thoughtful expression he had worn on the day he first offered me the summer position. "Still interested in dinner after all this?" he asked. I smiled. "I thought you would never ask again." He held out his hand, without making the moment more dramatic than it needed to be. I took it, and together we walked down the theater steps toward the Charleston evening. Not as employer and employee, and not simply as my best friend's father and his temporary hire, but as two men choosing to discover where this unexpected beginning might lead. I realized Max was right. The most important turning points rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they begin with an ordinary conversation, a temporary opportunity, or a person who notices potential long before we recognize it ourselves. Looking back, the greatest gift I received that summer was never the job offer. It was the confidence to believe that I had something meaningful to contribute, and the reminder that trust grows one honest choice at a time. Closing reflection. Perhaps some of the most meaningful opportunities arrive disguised as ordinary responsibilities. A temporary assignment, an unexpected conversation, or a quiet act of encouragement can gradually reshape the direction of a life without anyone realizing it at first. This story gently reminds us that trust is rarely built through dramatic moments alone. More often, it grows through consistency, patience, and the willingness to see the best in someone before they are able to see it themselves. There are times when another person's confidence becomes the bridge that carries us across our own uncertainty. And there are also moments when asking one honest question, listening with compassion, or offering one unexpected chance can change far more than any of us imagine. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone believed in you before you believed in yourself? And if you found yourself in Killian's place, what choice do you think you would have made and why?